Let's look at the record retention requirements for federal grant recipients. There are a number of different types of records covered under the administrative requirements, which must be retained and available to the federal government. The main types of records include financial records, procurement records, real property and equipment records, and other types of records such as indirect cost rate proposals and program reports. Financial records should include the source documentation that supports the financial and accounting records. Some examples of these records would include copies of paid bills, bank statements and copies of canceled checks, support for payrolls and time and attendance records, copies of contracts and sub-grant documents, and copies of prior authorization approval documents as required. Records for procurement of goods and services should contain a number of different documents. The main examples of supporting records in these files would be the procurement method rationale, backup for the contract type selection and basis for the contractor selection or rejection, the basis for the contract price, which would generally include a price or cost analysis, and if prior approval was required on any procurement, the prior approval evidence should be included in the procurement file. Moving on to real property and equipment records, grant recipients should be aware that there are extensive record-keeping requirements. Property records should contain the following data: a description of the property which contains a unique identifier such as a serial number, the cost and source of the property, for example, the vendor name if purchased, who holds the title, in other words, who owns the property, the federal government or the grantee, and the date the property was acquired and the percentage of federal participation in the acquisition cost. The grantee may also have continuing documentation requirements for real property and equipment, such as tracking the following items: the current location of the property, the current use and condition, and if the property is not in use, the disposition instructions, the date of disposal, and the sales price received from the disposal, if applicable. Finally, the grant recipient is required to retain other records which are pertinent to the federal awards. These types of records may contain evidence of subrecipient monitoring, such as copies of various A-133 audit reports, evidence of suspension and debarment compliance, such as screenshots of an excluded parties list system search, various program records that support program accomplishments and reporting, and evidence of contract provisions compliance for both the grantee and, if applicable, the sub-grantees and contractors. Additionally, there are record retention requirements for other types of records, such as indirect cost rate proposals and cost allocation plans, and all other records that may be pertinent to the award, such as cost share documentation and other compliance records. Generally, the federal grant recipient is required to retain these records for 3 years from the date of submission of the final expenditure report. This is the general rule for record retention. If the agency authorizes and the recipient submits quarterly or annual reports, the 3-year time frame will start from the date of submission of the annual or quarterly expenditure report. Now let's look at a couple of exceptions to the general rule. The first exception to the 3-year record retention general rule concerns records for real property and equipment. For real property and equipment, records must be retained for 3 years from the date of final disposition of the property. Depending on the use of the property, this could be considerably longer than 3 years from the date of award completion. The next exception to the 3-year general rule is in cases of litigation, claims or audits started before the 3-year period expires. In these cases, the recipient must retain records until all actions have been resolved and final actions related to the litigation, claims, or audits have been taken.